Chapter 17 of Daring Deeds of Famous Pirates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Heather Eney. Daring Deeds of Famous Pirates by Edward Keble Chatterton. Paul Jones, Pirate and Privateer. We come now to consider the exploits of another historical character, whose life and adventures will ever be of unfailing interest on both sides of the Atlantic. And yet, perhaps this amazing Scotsman is today better known in America than in Great Britain. Like many another before him, he rose from the rank of ordinary seaman to become a man that was to be had in great fear, if not respect. His fame has been celebrated in fiction, and very probably many a story of which he has been made the hero had no foundation in fact. There is some dispute concerning his birth, but it seems pretty certain that he was the son of John Paul, head gardener on Lord Selkirk's estate near Kirkcudbright. Paul Jones first saw light in the year 1728. Brought up on the shores of the Solway Firth, it was only likely that he gave up being assistant to his father and preferred the sea to gardening. In his character there developed many of those traits which have been such marked characteristics of the pirate breed. To realize Paul Jones, you must think of a wild, reckless nature burning with enthusiasm for adventure, yet excessively vain and desirous of recognition. He was a rebel, a privateer, a pirate, and a smuggler. He was a villain, he was quarrelsome, he was petty and mean. Finally, he was a traitor to his country. When he died, he had lived a most varied life, and had seen service on merchantmen, slaver, and man of war. After making several voyages to the West Indies in a merchantman, as an ordinary and able-bodied seaman, he was promoted to rank of mate, and then rose to the rank of master. Soon after the rupture between England and America, he happened to be in New England, and then it was that he succumbed to the temptation to desert his own national standard and to throw his aid on to the side of the revolutionists, for which reason he changed his real name of John Paul to that of Paul Jones. Notwithstanding that Jones has been justly condemned by biographers for having been a traitor, yet my own opinion is that this change arose far less from a desire to become an enemy of the British nation than from that overwhelming wanderlust and that irrepressible desire for adventure to which we have already called attention. There are some men who have never had enough fighting. So as soon as one campaign ends, they are unhappy until another begins, so that they may find a full outlet for their spirits. To such men as these, the daily round of a peaceful life is a perpetual monotony, and unless they can go forth to rove and wander, to fight or explore, their very souls would almost cry out for freedom. So I am convinced it was with Paul Jones. To such a man, nationalities mean nothing more than certain artificial considerations. The only real differences are those between the land and the sea. He knew that in the forthcoming war he would find just the adventure which delighted him. He would have every chance of obtaining booty, and in his own natural endowment, physical and mental, were splendidly suitable for such activities. He had a special knowledge of British pilotage, so he was a seaman distinctly worth having for any marauding expeditions that might be set going. So in the year 1777, we find him very busy as a commander, fitting out the privateer Ranger. This vessel mounted 18 guns as well as several swivel guns and had a desperate crew of 150 able men. He put to sea and made 2 captures on the European side of the Atlantic, sending each of these prizes into a French port. The following spring he went a step further in his character as a rebel, for he appeared off the Cumberland coast and began to attack a part of England that must have been singularly well known to him. He had made his landfall by daylight, but stood away until darkness set in. At midnight he ran closer in, and in grim silence he set away his boats with 30 men, all well armed and ready to perform a desperate job. Their objective was Whitehaven, the entrance to the harbor being commanded by a small battery, so their first effort must obviously be to settle that. Having landed with great care, they rushed upon the small garrison and made the whole lot prisoners. The guns of the battery were next spiked, and now they set about their next piece of daring. In the harbor, the ships were lying side by side, the tide being out. The good people of the town were asleep in their beds, and all the conditions were ideal for burning the shipping where it stood. Very stealthily the men went about their business, and had laid their combustibles on the decks all ready for firing as soon as the signal should be given. But just then something was happening. At the doors of the main street of the little town there was a series of loud knockings, and people began to wake and bustle about, and soon the sound of voices and the sights of crowds running down to the pier. The marauders had now to hurry on the rest of their work, for the alarm had been given and there was not a moment to lose. So hastily the privateers' men threw their matches on the decks and made for their boats and rowed off quickly to their ship. But luckily the inhabitants of Whitehaven had come down just in time, for they were able to extinguish the flames before serious damage had been done. What was their joy was keen annoyance to the privateers' men. But who was the good friend who had taken the trouble to rouse the town? Who had been so kind as to knock at the doors and to despoil the marauders of their night's work? When the shore party of the privateer mustered on deck, it was found that one man was missing, and this was the fellow who, for some conscientious or worldly motive, had gone over to the other side, and so saved both property and lives. So Jones went a few miles farther north, crossed his familiar Solway Firth, and entered the River Dee, on the left bank of which stands Kirkcudbright. He entered the estuary at dawn, and let go anchor off Lord Selkirk's castle. When the natives saw this warlike ship in their river, with her guns and her formidable appearance generally, they began to fear she was a man of war come to impress men for the navy. It happened that the noble lord was away from his home in London, and when the men servants at the castle espied what they presumed to be a king's ship, they begged Lady Selkirk for leave and go hide themselves, lest they might be impressed into the service. A boat was sent from the ship, and a strong body of men landed and marched to the castle, which, to the surprise of all, they surrounded. Lady Selkirk had just finished breakfast when she was summoned to appear before the leader of the men, whose rough clothes soon showed the kind of fellows they were. Armed with pistols, swords, muskets, and even an American tomahawk, they inquired for Lord Selkirk, only to be assured his lordship was away. The next request was that all the family plate should be handed over. So all that was in the castle was yielded, even to the silver teapot which was on the breakfast table and had not yet been washed out. The silver was packed up, and with many apologies for having had to transact this dirty business, as one of the officers called it, the pirates went back to their ship rather richer than they had set out. But the inhabitants of the castle were as much surprised as they were thankful to find their own lives had not been demanded as well as the plate. The ship got under way after some time and put to sea without any further incident. Now the rest of this story of the plate runs as follows, and shows another side to the character of the head gardener's son. For a few days after this visit, Lady Selkirk received a letter from Jones apologizing for what had been done, and stating that this raid had been neither suggested nor sanctioned by him. On the contrary, he had used his best influence to prevent its occurrence, but his officers and crew had insisted on the deed, with a view to capturing Lord Selkirk, for whose ransom they hoped to obtain a large sum of money. As an earnest of his own innocence in the matter, Paul Jones added that he would try to purchase from his associates the booty which they had brought away, and even if he could not return the entire quantity, he would send back all that he could. We need not stop to wonder whether Lady Selkirk really believed such a statement. But the truth is that about 5 years later, the whole of the plate came back, carriage paid, in exactly the same condition as it had left the castle. Apparently it had never been unpacked, for the tea leaves were still in the teapot, just as they had been taken away on that exciting morning. But to come back to the ship. After leaving the Solway Firth astern, Jones stood over to the Irish coast and entered Belfast Lough, amusing himself on the way by burning or capturing several fishing craft. But it happened that he was espied by Captain Burden of HMS Drake, a sloop. Seeing Jones' ship coming along, he took her to be a merchantman, and so from her he could impress some seamen. So the officer lowered a boat and sent her off. But when the boat's crew came aboard Jones' vessel, they had the surprise of their lives. For instead of arresting, they were themselves arrested. And this it seemed to Jones more prudent to leave Belfast alone and get away with his capture. Meanwhile, Captain Burden was getting anxious about his men, as the boat had not returned. Moreover, he noticed that the supposed merchantman was now crowding on all possible sail. So he at once prepared his sloop for giving chase and prepared for action, and on coming up with the privateer began a sharp fire. Night, however, intervened, and the firing had to stop. But when daylight returned, the engagement recommenced and continued for an hour. A fierce encounter was fought on both sides, and at length Captain Burden and his first lieutenant were killed, as well as 20 of the crew disabled. The Drake's topmast was shot away and the ship was considerably damaged, so that there was no other alternative but to surrender to the privateer. But as both sides of the Irish Channel were now infuriated against Jones, he determined to leave these parts and, taking his prize with him, proceeded to Brest, where he arrived in safety. In the following year, instead of the Ranger, he had command of a frigate called the Bonhomme Richard, a 40-gun ship with 370 crew. In addition to this vessel, he also had the frigate Alliance of 36 guns and 300 crew, the brig Vengeance, 14 guns and 70 men, a cutter of 18 tons, and a French frigate named the Pallas. All except the last mentioned were in the service of the American Congress. A little further down the coast of the Bay of Biscay than Brest is Loraine, and from this port Jones sailed with the above fleet in the summer of 1779, arriving off the Kerry coast, where he sent a boat's crew ashore to bring back sheep. But the natives captured the boat's crew and lodged them in Tralee jail. After this, Jones sailed to the east of Scotland and captured a number of prizes, all of which he sent on to France. Finally, he determined to attempt no less a plan than burn the shipping in Leith Harbour and collect tribute from the undefended towns of the Fifeshire coast. He came into the Firth of Forth, but as both wind and tide were foul, he let go under the island of Inchkeith. Next day he weighed anchor and again tried to make Leith, but the breeze had now increased to a gale, and he sprung one of his topmasts, which caused him to bear up and leave the Firth. He now rejoined his squadron and cruised along the east coast of England. Towards the end of September he fell in with a British convoy bound for the Baltic, being escorted by 2 men of war, namely HMS Serapis, 44 guns, and HMS Countess of Scarborough, 20 guns. And then followed a most memorable engagement. In order that the reader may be afforded some opportunity of realizing how doughty an opponent was this Paul Jones, and how this Corsair was able to make a ship of the Royal Navy strike colors, I append the following dispatch, which was written by Captain Pearson, R.N., who commanded the Serapis. The Countess of Scarborough was under the command of Captain Thomas Piercy, and this officer also confirmed the account of the disaster. The narrative is so succinct and clear that it needs no further explanation. The letter was written from the Texel, whither Persian was afterwards taken. Palace Frigate in Congress Service, Texel, October 6, 1779. On the 23rd ultimate, being close in with Scarborough about 12 o'clock, a boat came on board with a letter from the bailiffs of that corporation, giving information of a flying squadron of the enemy's ship being on the coast, of a part of the said squadron having been seen from thence the day before standing to the southward. As soon as I received this intelligence, I made the signal for the convoy to bear down under my lee, and repeated it with 2 guns. Notwithstanding which, the van of the convoy kept their wind with all sail stretching out to the southward from under Flamborough Head, till between 12 and 1, when the headmost of them got sight of the enemy's ships, which were then in chase of them. They then tacked and made the best of their way under the shore for Scarborough, letting fly their topgallant sheets and firing guns, upon which I made all the sail I could to windward, to get between the enemy's ship and the convoy, which I soon effected. At 1 o'clock we got sight of the enemy's ship from the masthead, and about 4 we made them plain from the deck to be 3 large ships and a brig, upon which I made the Countess of Scarborough's signal to join me, she being inshore with the convoy. At the same time I made the signal for the convoy to make the best of their way, and repeated the signal with 2 guns. I then brought to let the Countess Scarborough come up, and cleared ship for action. At 5:30 the Countess of Scarborough joined me, the enemy's ships bearing down upon us with a light breeze at the SSW. At 6, tacked and laid our head inshore, in order to keep our ground the better between the enemy's ships and the convoy. Soon after which we perceived the ships bearing down upon us to be a 2-decked ship and 2 frigates, but from their keeping end upon us in bearing down, we could not discern what colors they were under. At 20 minutes past 7, the largest ship of the 2 brought to on our lee bow within musket shot. I hailed him and asked what ship it was. They answered in English, the Princess Royal. I then asked where they belonged to. They answered evasively, on which I told them if they did not answer directly, I would fire into them. They then answered with a shot, which was instantly returned with a broadside, and after exchanging 2 or 3 broadsides, he backed his topsails and dropped upon our quarter within pistol shot, then filled again, put his helm a-weather, and ran us on board upon our weather quarter, and attempted to board us, but being repulsed, he sheered off, upon which I backed our topsails in order to get square with him again, which as soon as he observed, he then filled, put his helm a-weather, and laid us athwart hawse. His mizzen shrouds took our jib boom, which hung for some time, till at last it gave way, and we dropped alongside each other head and stern, when the fluke of our spare anchor hooking his quarter, we became so close fore and aft that the muzzles of our guns touched each other's sides. In this position we engaged from 8:30 till 10:30, during which time, from the great quantity and variety of combustible matters which they threw upon our decks, chains, and in short into every part of the ship, we were on fire not less than 10 or 12 times in different parts of the ship, and it was with the greatest difficulty and exertion imaginable at times that we were able to get it extinguished. At the same time, the largest of the 2 frigates kept sailing round us during the whole action and raking us fore and aft, by which means she killed or wounded almost every man on the quarter and main decks. At 9:30, either from a hand grenade being thrown at one of our lower deck ports, or from some other accident, a cartridge of powder was set on fire, the flames of which were running from cartridge to cartridge all the way aft, blew up the whole of the people and officers that were quartered abaft the mainmast. from which unfortunate circumstance all those guns were rendered useless for the remainder of the action, and I fear the greatest part of the people will lose their lives. At 10 o'clock they called for quarters from the ship alongside, and said they had struck. Hearing this, I called upon the captain to say if they had struck, or if he had asked for quarter. But receiving no answer, after repeating my words 2 or 3 times, I called for the boarders and ordered them to board, which they did. But the moment they were on board her, they discovered a superior number lying under cover, with pikes in their hands ready to receive them, on which our people retreated instantly into our own ship and returned to their guns again until 10:30, when the frigate, coming across our stern and pouring her broadside into us again, without our being able to bring a gun to bear on her, I found it in vain, and in short impracticable from the situation we were in to stand out any longer with any prospect of success. I therefore struck. Our mainmast at the same time went by the board. The first lieutenant and myself were immediately escorted into the ship alongside, where we found her to be an American ship of war, called the Bonhomme Richard, of 40 guns and 375 men, commanded by Captain Paul Jones. The other frigate which engaged us to be the Alliance, of 40 guns and 300 men, and the third frigate which engaged and took the Countess of Scarborough after 2 hours' action to be the Pallas, a French frigate of 30 guns and 275 men. The Vengeance, an armed brig of 12 guns and 70 men, all in Congress service, under the command of Paul Jones. They fitted out and sailed from Port Loraine the latter end of July and came north about. They have on board 300 English prisoners, which they have taken in different vessels in their way round since they left France, and have ransomed some others. On my going on board the Bonhomme Richard, I found her in the greatest distress, her quarters and counter on the lower deck being entirely drove in, and the whole of her lower deck guns dismounted. She was also on fire in 2 places, and 6 or 7 feet of water in her hold, which kept increasing upon them all night and next day, till they were obliged to quit her. She had 300 men killed and wounded in the action. Our loss in the Serapis was also very great. My officers and people in general behaved well, and I should be very remiss in my attentions to their merit were I to omit recommending them to their lordships' favour. I must at the same time beg leave to inform their lordships that Captain Piercy, in the Countess of Scarborough, was not the least remiss in his duty, he having given me every assistance in his power, and as much as could be expected from such a ship in engaging the attention of the Pallas, a frigate of 32 guns during the whole action. I am extremely sorry for the accident that has happened, that of losing His Majesty's ship which I had the honor to command, but at the same time I flatter myself with the hope that their lordships will be convinced that she has not been given away, but on the contrary, that every exertion has been used to defend her, and that 2 essential pieces of service to our country have arisen from it. The one in wholly oversetting the crews and intentions of this flying squadron. The other is rescuing the whole of a valuable convoy from falling into the hands of the enemy, which must have been the case had I acted any otherwise than I did. We have been driving about the North Sea ever since the action, and endeavoring to make to any port we possibly could, but have not been able to get into any place till today we arrived in the Texel. Herewith I enclose you the most correct list of the killed and wounded I have as yet been able to procure, from my people being dispersed among the different ships, and having been refused permission to make much of them. R. Pearson. P.S. I am refused permission to wait on Sir Joseph Yorke, footnote, the British ambassador, end footnote, and even to go on shore. The killed were 1 boatswain, 1 master's mate, 2 midshipmen, 1 quartermaster, 29 sailors, 15 marines, 49. Wounded, 2nd Lieutenant Michael Stanhope, Lieutenant Whiteman, Marines, 2 surgeons' mates, 6 petty officers, 46 sailors, 12 marines, total 68. It is obvious that the British officers had fought their ships most gallantly, and the king showed his appreciation by conferring the honor of knighthood on Captain Pearson, and soon after Piercy was promoted to the rank of post-captain, and promotion was also granted to the other officers. But recognition was shown not merely by the state, but by the city. For the directors of the Royal Exchange Assurance Company presented Pearson with a piece of plate valued at 100 guineas, and Piercy with a similar gift valued at 50 guineas. They further voted their thanks to the officers for having protected the rich fleets under their care. The British ambassador, Sir Joseph Yorke, had considerable difficulty in procuring the release of the prisoners which Paul Jones had made from His Majesty's ships. And although he strenuously urged the States General to detain Jones and his ships as a rebel subject with unlawful ships, yet the squadron, after being carefully blockaded, succeeded in escaping one dark night to Dunkirk. Jones had lost his ship, the Bonhomme Richard, as a result of the fight, and now made the Alliance his flagship. The story of Paul Jones from now is not capable of completion. For a period of several years his movements were somewhat mysterious, although it is known that on one occasion he sailed across the Atlantic in the remarkable time of 3 weeks with dispatches from the American Congress. Then the fame of this remarkable fellow begins to wane. After peace was concluded, the active brain and fervent spirit of this Paul Jones were not required, and he chafed against the fetters of unemployment. It is true that he offered his services to the Empress of Russia in 1778, but he seems very soon to have gone to Paris, where he spent the rest of his life. There was no employment for him in the French Navy, and finally he was reduced to abject poverty and ended his days in the year 1792. The reader will doubtless have in mind that less than 10 years ago the United States had the body of Paul Jones brought across the Atlantic and reburied in North America. It is not quite easy altogether to estimate the character of a man so contradictory as Paul Jones. Had he been born in another age and placed in different circumstances, there is no telling how illustrious he might not have become. He was certainly a magnificent seaman and fighting man, but over and above all he was an adventurer. Idolized as a hero both in America and France, he struck terror in Britain. His latest biographer has stated that the skull and crossbones never fluttered from his masthead, and that he never sailed with a letter of marque. But that being so, it can only be a mere quibble which can save him from being reckoned among the most notorious pirates of history. A pirate is a person who performs acts of piracy. It seems to me that it makes little difference whether he hoists the conventional black pirate flag or not. It is not the flag which makes a pirate, but the deeds and intentions of which he is responsible. And if his biographer is correct in saying that Jones was never commissioned as a privateer, that is still one more proof that in raiding Whitehaven, the coasts of Scotland, Ireland, England, capturing and burning merchant or fishing craft on the seas, taking their crews into bondage, he was acting without any shred of legality and therefore a pirate pure and simple. A pirate, and a very daring pirate, he certainly was, though he was primarily a sailor of fortune. As one can see from his life, his devotion of adventure was far superior to his devotion to nationality, Scotch, English, French, American, or Russian. He was willing and anxious to go wherever there was fighting, wherever glory could be obtained. He was a man who despised those who did not keep their word, and in the incident of his fulfillment of the promise made to Lady Selkirk in respect of the family plate, we have, at any rate in the life of Paul Jones, a proof that sometimes there is honor among thieves. But his death in abject poverty is but another illustration of the tragic ending which was customary in the lives of many notorious pirates. End of chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of Daring Deeds of Famous Pirates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Reuben James 43. Daring Deeds of Famous Pirates by Edward Keble Chatterton, a notorious American pirate. Chapter 18. A Notorious American Pirate. The notorious sea robber of whom we were to speak in the following chapter has an especial interest for English and American readers, from the fact that he was a member of the Chesapeake during her historic duel with the Shannon. This Charles Gibbs was born in the state of Rhode Island in the year 1794. From the sulky, refractory character which he exhibited as a child, any reader of human nature could have guessed that his career promised none too well, and when his full powers had been developed, he developed finally into a singularly cruel robber of the sea. From one cruelty to another he sunk lower and lower until the inevitable gallows were ready to put an end to his atrocities. Possessed of that roving spirit which was ever an early characteristic of those who were destined to become pirates, he threw up his work as farmhand at the age of 15, ran away from home, and signed on as one of the crew in the United States sloop of war Hornet. Off the coast of Pernambuco, the ship was in action and captured HMS sloop Peacock. The commander of the former was Captain Lawrence, and on his return he was promoted to command the Chesapeake, and to that ship Gibbs accompanied him. When the Shannon emerged from the fray victorious, the survivors were taken as prisoners and imprisoned in Dartmoor, among them being Charles Gibbs. When prisoners were exchanged, he returned to Boston, Captain Lawrence having fallen in the engagement. For a time Gibbs now abandoned the sea and set up in business, but he was unable to lead a respectable life ashore, so back he went to sea, this time on board a privateer belonging to Buenos Aires. But a quarrel arising between the officers of the one part and the crew regarding the division of prize money, there ensued a mutiny. The mutineers won the victory and took possession of the ship. They proceeded to the coast of Florida, landed some of the ship's company, and then sailed to the West Indies to perform their piratical exploits, and in a short time had captured more than 20 ships and murdered about 400 human beings, Havana being used as the port where they could conveniently dispose of their plunder. It is difficult to speak of a man like Charles Gibbs in cold blood. He was not a mere pirate, but a blackguard and murderer of the vilest type. Of him it may be said in very truth that with his death the world lost nothing, but was the gainer. A pirate who in the heat of the moment, when he is being violently opposed by another, kills the aggressor, is a criminal whom we can understand, though not acquit. But a human fiend who for no particular reason unnecessarily sheds bloods and bereaves women of husbands and children of fathers is a devil incarnate. Such was Gibbs. In the year 1819 he departed from Havana and returned to the United States. His accumulated wealth, as a result of so many piracies, amounted to about £6,000. After passing some time in New York and Boston, he sailed for England on the Emerald, but in 1826 was back again in the United States. Hearing of the war between Brazil and the Buenos Aires Republic, he sailed from Boston to fight, if possible, on behalf of the Republic. He made himself known to Admiral Brown and presently received a lieutenant's commission, being assigned to a 34-gun ship. For 4 months he served in this ship, and then as a result of his satisfactory conduct he was given command of a privateer schooner which carried 2 24-pounders and 46 men. Sailing from Buenos Aires, he made a couple of successful privateering cruises, and then was able to purchase a half share in a Baltimore schooner. But after putting to sea he was captured 7 days out and taken into Rio de Janeiro, where he remained until the declaration of peace and eventually returned to New York. There followed another year's interval in roaming about from place to place, and then the French campaign against Algiers attracted him, not to fight on behalf of the French, but for the pirates. He accordingly embarked on a ship that landed him at Barcelona, whence he crossed to Port Mahon and tried to make his way to Algiers. But the vigilance of the French fleet prevented him from getting any nearer than Tunis, and at last returned from Marseille to Boston. A few days later he went to New Orleans, and there he signed on as one of the crew on board the Vineyard brig. Up till now he had led a restless, wandering, wicked life of self-indulgence. He had robbed and murdered. But now we come to the climax and decline of his career. The details which follow are essential to the story, and they indicate better than any number of words the type of character which Gibbs belonged. The skipper of this brig was William Thornby. She sailed away from New Orleans, bound for Philadelphia, with a valuable cargo of cotton, sugar, molasses, as well as over 10,000 pounds in dollars. When the ship was about 5 days out from her port, the crew began to talk about the money on board, and some of them, including Charles Gibbs, made up their minds to seize the ship. Before attaining this object, they realized they would have to kill the captain and mate. On the night of the 23rd of November, soon after midnight, the opportunity for putting this dastardly deed into action arrived. One of the crew named Dawes was at the helm. As the brig was plowing her way over the lonely sea, rolling her mass across a star-speckled sky, the steersman suddenly saw the steward emerge from below with a light in one hand and a knife in the other. He set down the light, and then taking the top of the pump, struck the captain in the head. The latter cried, "Murder!" But he was then seized firmly by Gibbs and the cook at the head and heels, and without further delay hove overboard. Roused by the unwonted noise on deck, the mate now came up the hatchway, but as he approached, 2 others of the crew named Atwell and Church were waiting for him, and struck him in the head just as he was asking the reason of the noise. The mate then rushed back into his cabin, followed by Gibbs, who by the reason of the darkness could not find him. So the murderer ran on deck, fetched the binnacle light with the aid of which the helmsman was steering, and returned below. This time he found his victim, and 2 others of the crew knocked him down and then dragged him on deck. Dawes, since he could not now see his compass to steer by, left the helm to see what was going on. And as the other men were hauling the mate along, they called to Dawes to assist them. In a few moments the mate was thrown over the side alive and was even heard to cry out from the water twice. He was never picked up, so must have been drowned. Dawes was terrified beyond expression at these 2 incidents, so that he scarcely knew what to do. The Confederates then ordered him to call a man named James Talbot, who had declined to take part in the plot. Talbot was in the forecastle saying his prayers. He came up, and the Confederates did not instantly put him to death as he had quite expected, but on the contrary gave him some grog. The captain and mate being now out of the way, the Confederates then got up a keg containing dollars. They then divided the captain's clothes, the sum of 8 pounds which he possessed, and a gold watch. Dawes was ordered to go back to the helm and steer for Long Island, while Talbot was likewise compelled to do as he was told. The next day several more kegs of specie amounting to 1,000 pounds each were divided and the specie placed into bags and sewn up. After this the money was divided up without counting it. Gibbs had been acting as captain ever since the 2 murders, and when they arrived about 15 miles south-southeast of Southampton Light, the ship's boats were ordered out. Half the money was placed in each, and the survivors got in. Before doing so, however, the ship was scuttled and set fire to in the cabin, so that before long she would founder and so not exist as possible evidence against the assassins. But after the boats had rowed away towards the shore, soon after daylight, they struck on the bar. One of them was saved by throwing overboard about 1,000 pounds in dollars, but the other was seen to fill and founder as the men in her vainly sought to cling to the mast of the craft. Those in the other craft, however, were more fortunate and landed on Barren Island, buried the money in the sand, and soon afterwards fell in with a man who took them to the only house on the island. But justice, if delayed, advanced with sure and certain steps. In the month of February 1831, Charles Gibbs and a man named Wansley, who had been one of the Confederates, were brought up for trial in New York on a charge of murdering Captain Thornby. Wansley was a Negro and was found guilty and condemned to death. Gibbs, in his defense, said that when the ship started out from New Orleans, he was a stranger to all on board excepting Dawes and 1 other. He pretended that it was not he himself who first suggested taking the money, but after the subject had been discussed for some days, he agreed to join in the plot. He even protested, he alleged, that it would be better to give up the plan, as it was a serious thing to take a human life and commit piracy. This, be it remembered, was Gibbs' version of the affair, but having regard to his past record, there is every reason to suppose that he was now adding lies to his other guilt. 3 days later he averred the murder took place, and all that he did was to help throw the captain's body overboard after he had been struck, when he presumed he had been killed. He protested further that he was innocent of the mate's murder. But the judge pointed out that even if Gibbs had not actually done the deed, he was there strongly instigating the murderers on without stretching out a hand to save them. It is murder as much to stand by and encourage the deed as to stab with a knife, strike with a hatchet, or shoot with a pistol. It is not only murder in law, but in your own feelings and in your own conscience. So spoke the judge. And he who had spent a life of license and piracy, marked by murders with only occasional legitimate fighting, was condemned to the scaffold. To the end Gibbs, while admitting his guilt of piracy, yet insisting that he was innocent of the charge of murdering the captain, although, "It is true I stood by and saw the fatal deed done, and stretched not forth my arm to save them." Wainsley, however, frankly admitted the justice of the sentence and died penitent. We need say no more, but if there are any today who still have a secret affection for the pirates of yesterday, we can only suggest that although few of these pirates were cowards, yet there is not one who showed himself little more than a vulture in human form. Very rare indeed does one find instances of these rude fellows giving mercy. There is now and again such an occasion, but is like a stray blade of herbage in a wilderness. Personal vanity, the determination to get rich at all costs, has brought many a crime in its wake. And if men are still dishonest in other ways, we can at least be thankful that the wholesale murders of the days of the pirates have long since ended. End of Chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of Daring Deeds of Famous Pirates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shasta, Oakland, California. Daring Deeds by Famous Pirates by Edward Keble Chatterton. The last of the Algerine Corsairs. And now let us take a final look at that pestilential spot, Algiers. We have seen how that during the 16th and 17th centuries it had been constantly attacked and conquered, but before long the Algerines had again broken out into piracy. So soon after invaders withdrew their forces, the Corsairs rebuilt their walls, fitted out their new craft, and went roving the seas and harassing innocent ships. They had pillaged the coastline of the French Riviera, burning and killing and destroying in their ruthless manner, and then the French had been compelled to send Admiral Duquesne against them, who had bombarded the place for a time until bad weather had caused him to withdraw his ships from Algiers. The pirate trouble had therefore begun afresh, and the Dey had sent to Louis the impudent message that if the French monarch would give him half the money the last French expedition had cost, the Dey would be pleased to burn down his city. So, once more Duquesne had been sent out, who had bombarded Algiers and caused wholesale destruction. Then he had consented to cease firing and discuss terms. But in the meantime, the Dey had been assassinated by his own followers, who now elected a new one and ordered the Algerine flag to be rehoisted on their walls. With greater fervor, hostilities were now resumed, and in a few days the place was reduced to ashes, and large numbers of the Algerines had perished. This so furiated the new Dey that he ordered all the French captives to be cruelly murdered and with great brutality caused Father Vacher to be bound hand and foot, tied to a mortar, and fired off like a bomb against the French fleet outside. Duquesne had then brought his ships as near in as possible, destroyed all their shipping, fortifications, and buildings, and, having done all that he could, sailed away, leaving the Algerines plenty of subjects for meditation. And yet it was not long before these pirates had regained their good spirits and were again engaged in piracy. Was it not their profession and calling? Was it not by such methods that they kept themselves alive? They knew perfectly well they were rogues, but as other men were traders, so they were pirates. Therefore, diplomatic measures being obviously impotent, the only way to treat with them was to keep on sending expedition after expedition. In 1700, Captain Beach attacked 7 of their craft, drove them on shore, and burnt them. Less than 100 years later, 10 American ships had been seized by these Corsairs, and 150 men from their crews taken into captivity. In order to obtain these men back, the Americans had to pay a heavy ransom and build the Day a 36-gun frigate, but thereby they also received protection for the American ships and the right of free trade with Algiers. At an earlier stage of this book, I have had occasion in discussing the Moslem Corsairs to refer to the port of Bona, a little to the east of Algiers. In the year 1816, there was an establishment here for carrying on the coral fishery under the protection of the British flag. Hither came a number of Corsican, Neapolitan, and other Italian fishercraft. Ascension Day in that year fell on the 23rd of May, and as the fishermen were about to attend Mass, there was a gun fired from the castle, and simultaneously there rushed into sight 2,000 infantry and cavalry, consisting of Moors, Turks, and Levanters. Fire was opened on the poor fishermen, and practically the whole lot were massacred. The English flags were then torn to pieces and trampled on. The British Vice-Consul's house was pillaged, as well as the supplies of coral which had been obtained by the fishermen. As soon as news of this incident reached England, the country was roused to immediate action, and a punitive expedition was got together and sent out under Admiral Lord Exmouth. He had been delayed by headwinds, but got under way in the last week of July. His flagship was the 120-gun Queen Charlotte, Rear Admiral Sir David Milne being second in command in the 90-gun Impregnable. There were also 3 74-gun ships, in addition to a number of frigates, brigs, bombs, fireships, and several smaller ships well supplied with shrapnel and the ordinary means of warfare of those times. By the 9th of August, the fleet had arrived and anchored at Gibraltar, where it was joined by the Dutch fleet of 5 frigates and a corvette under Admiral Van Capellen. Meanwhile, His Majesty's ship Prometheus had been dispatched ahead to Algiers to bring away the British consul and his family, but did not succeed in the entire task. By disguising them in midshipman's uniform, the consul's wife and daughter were able to escape, but the consul had been seized by the Dey and thrown into chains. For the Algerine had learnt from French papers of the forthcoming British expedition, and having heard of the escape of Mr. and Mrs. MacDonald, he immediately ordered the detention of 2 of the boats from the Prometheus which chanced to be ashore. The crews were thrown into slavery, but when this information reached the ears of Lord Exmouth, this, if anything were wanting, completed his eagerness to wipe out the plague spot of European civilization. So the fleet left Gibraltar and arrived before Algiers on 27th August. An interpreter was sent ashore with Lieutenant Burgess, the Admiral's flag lieutenant, under a flag of truce, with a letter to the Dey demanding reparation, and while this was being done, the fleet, taking advantage of a light breeze springing up, came into the bay and hove to about a mile from Algiers. But after waiting beyond the stipulated time, since no answer was forthcoming, Mr. Burgess and the interpreter returned to the flagship, where everyone was ready and anxious for the order to blaze away at the enemy. The admiral now made a signal to know whether all the ships were prepared, and the affirmative answer being returned, the Queen Charlotte led the line towards the shore, and, to the amazement of the enemy, ran across all the batteries without firing or receiving a single shot. She then brought up within 80 yards of that mole which the reader will recollect had been built long years before by Christian captives. The spot selected by the admiral was where an Algerine brig was seen lying. The rest of the fleet, including the Dutch vessels, then took up their assigned positions in regular order. When Lord Exmouth attacked this den of piracy and cruelty, even the British women served at the same guns as their husbands and never shrank. The position of the Queen Charlotte had been selected with great foresight, for here she was exposed to only 3 or 4 flanking guns, while her own broadside swept the whole of the enemy's batteries. But so far not a shot had been fired, and the shore batteries were lined with spectators, who gazed in astonishment at the quiet order with which the ships had each come to her berth in such proximity to the defensive works. For a time Lord Exmouth was in hopes that the Dey would yield to his lordship's demands, but this delay was not caused by any intention on the part of the enemy, but owing to the fact that the Algerines were completely unprepared for such a sudden approach, and their guns were not even shotted. It was only as the fleet came to anchor that the gunners ashore could be seen getting busy. To the last minute, the British admiral was minded to spare human life, and even was seen on the quarterdeck, repeatedly waving his hat as a warning to the crowd to retire from the mole. So at 2:45 p.m. the enemy opened fire at the Queen Charlotte. Before the sound of the firing reached his ears, and while the first smoke was visible, Lord Exmouth gave the order to fire, and then 3 broadsides were fired in about 6 minutes, the rest of the fleet following the example. This caused terrible devastation ashore, as many as 500 people being killed or wounded. Then the attack began in deadly earnest. It was a repetition of the history of the 16th century. On the one hand, the Christian forces of Europe, on the other, the infidel Corsairs and enemies of the human race. Both sides fought with the same fierceness which had marked their contests in many a previous generation. In the hot, overpowering sun, with the last vestige of breeze vanished away, the gunners blazed away in fine style. Algerine vessels in close proximity to the English fleet burst forth into flames and for a time endangered the wooden walls of England. On both sides, frightful slaughter was taking place. The Dey had 500 guns mounted and doing their work to our great loss. But our own men and guns were hurling death into the nest of pirates in a manner that surprised the Algerines. There was in the breasts of the invaders not merely the hatred of the Algerines as infidels and pirates, but the fact that these men had been responsible for the capture of so many Christian ships and the cruelties to so many European seamen sufficed to increase the determination and enthusiasm with which the destruction was being dealt out to these poisonous wasps. But if the enemy was clearly suffering heavy losses, the attackers were not without heavy casualties. About sunset, Rear Admiral Milne made a signal to Lord Exmouth announcing the losses on the Impregnable alone as 150 killed and wounded, and requesting that, if possible, a frigate might be sent to take off some of the enemy's fire. The Glasgow was therefore ordered to go, and actually got up her anchor, but the wind was so scant that she was obliged again to let go, though in a rather more favorable position. But meanwhile, on shore, flames were bursting out and making an end to matters. One of the enemy frigates had been gallantly boarded and set on fire, but now all the Algerine ships in the port were in flames, and thence the fire spread with all devouring force to the arsenal and storehouse, causing a marvelous sight against the background of darkness. Our shells had been splendidly aimed, and although in some cases they had to be fired right across our own men of war, yet never an accident occurred to our ships as they went to find their billet in the home of the Algerine pirates. And then, as if to bring about the climax of this hot battle, the attacking fleet had brought near to the battery of the enemy a special ship which had been specially charged with explosives, and as she blew up there was another wealth of damage done to the cause of the defenders, and so by midnight the enemy's batteries had been silenced, and in the morning the Dey was compelled to surrender. The net result of Lord Exmouth's fine attack was as follows. 1,200 Christians were released from their terrible slavery. All the demands were complied with. The British consul had been indemnified for his losses, and the Dey, in the presence of all his officers, made an apology for the insults offered. Even though a few years later the French had further trouble with these Algerines, yet Exmouth's expedition had the effect of giving the death blow to a monster that had worried Europe for about 3 centuries. The scourge of the tideless Mediterranean had been obliterated. The murders and enslavery of so many thousands and thousands of European Christians of past centuries had been avenged, and a universal enemy which neither Charles V nor Andrea Doria nor many another had been able to exterminate was now laid low. The combined squadrons of those 2 historic maritime nations, Great Britain and Holland, had shown that even a race so long accustomed to the sea as the Algerine pirates could not resist for all time. In the history of the world, few nations have ever done so much for the development of ships and sea power as these 2 northern peoples, and the chance which enabled them to combine forces against a common evil of such antiquity was singularly happy. End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of Daring Deeds of Famous Pirates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daring Deeds of Famous Pirates by Edward Keble Chatterton. Pirates of the Persian Gulf. We have seen throughout this volume that there have always been certain geographical areas which have been favoured by pirates as their suitable sphere for roving. Madagascar, Malabar, the north coast of Africa, the West Indies. These and others have been the scene not of one piratical incident, but of scores. The Persian Gulf is to this day not quite the peaceful corner of the globe that undoubtedly someday it will become. It is still patrolled by the Royal Navy for various reasons, including the prevention of gun running. Just how long the Persian Gulf has been navigated, it would be impossible to say. But there is every reason to suppose that if the first kind of boat which ever floated was seen on the Tigris or Euphrates, the first seagoing craft was observed in the Persian Gulf. At any rate, it is certain that the Arabians who occupy that peninsula which separates the Red Sea from the Persian Gulf were in the early stages of history the greatest navigators and seamen anywhere. Even right down to the Middle Ages, for scientific navigation, with the aid of those nautical instruments which were the forerunners of our modern sextant, there were no mariners who could find their way across the trackless seas so skillfully as these inhabitants of Arabia. From time immemorable, there have dwelt on the west side of the Persian Gulf an Arabian tribe named the Joassamies, engaged in maritime pursuits, either in trading or pearl fishing, or as pilots to strange ships entering the Gulf, or else acting as pirates. For it was obvious to them that this last mentioned occupation held out much that was tempting. So the Joassamees began in a small way pillaging the coasting vessels of the Gulf, and, as they found their efforts in this respect were so successful, they aspired to bigger things. We are speaking now of that fascinating period of the sailing ship, which belongs to the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th centuries. The reader will instantly call to mind those fine ships of the East India Company, so smart and similar to the ships of the Royal Navy in appearance, and so similar in discipline and actual build. Shortly before the close of the 18th century, the Viper, a 10-gun East Indiaman, was lying at anchor in the Bushehr roads. Bushehr is a port on the east or Persian side of the Gulf. In the same harbour there were at anchor also a few dhows. Up till now, these pirates had never molested an English ship. They had confined their attentions to native craft, so no efforts had been made to deal with them. Now the skippers of these dhows had applied to the Persian agent of the East India Company for a supply of gunpowder and cannon shot to last them out their cruise, and, as the agent had no suspicions whatsoever, he gave them an order to the commanding officer on board for the desired quantity. It happened that the Viper's captain was ashore, so the order was produced to the officer in charge. The quantity mentioned was handed over, and the dhows began to make sail. The Viper's crew were breakfasting on deck, and the officers below, when, without any warning, a couple of these dhows began to cannonade the Viper, and the crews attempted to come aboard. No time was lost on the Indiaman, however, for the officers rushed up on deck, called the crew to quarters, cut the hempen cable, got sail on her so as to be ready for manoeuvring, and a regular engagement began between the Viper and the 4 dhows, which had plenty of men and big guns. It was a determined onslaught, and Lieutenant Carruthers, the commanding officer, was wounded in the lower part of the body, but bravely kept on until he was killed by a ball in the forehead. The command now fell on Mr. Salter, midshipman, who continued the fight not less courageously, and, after a keen encounter, drove the pirates off and chased them out to sea. This gave them a severe lesson, so that years passed by before another similar attempt was made on the British flag. But in the year 1804 there was a renewed attempt, and the following story, though a little involved, is of real interest. It begins with the East India Company's cruiser named Fly, and the scene is still the Persian Gulf. At the time we are speaking of, this ship was off the island of Ken, when she had the bad misfortune to be attacked by a French privateer. In order, however, to prevent the enemy boarding her, she was purposely run onto a shoal, and the government dispatches which she was carrying, together with some treasure, were thrown overboard in 2.5 fathoms, cross-bearings having first been taken, so that perhaps these might be recovered at some future date. The passengers and crew were taken to Bushehr and set at liberty. They then purchased a dhow by subscription, fitted her out, and sailed down the Gulf, bound for Bombay. On their way they stopped near Ken Island to recover the dispatches and treasure. The former they managed to get up again, and as there was no time to waste, they left the treasure and were hurrying on to their goal. But when they got to the south of the Gulf, they had even worse fortune, for they were attacked by a fleet of Joassame pirates and taken into the port of Ras Al Khaimah, which was to these Arabian rovers what Algiers had been to the Corsairs of the Mediterranean. Here the English remained in the hope of being ransomed, but no such opportunity occurred. Months went by, and at last they determined to do what they could. They informed the pirate chief of the treasure, which lay sunk in the gulf, and assured him that having taken good cross-bearings of the spot by marks on the shore, the wealth could be recovered, if some of these Arabians, so accustomed to pearl diving, would assist them. The arrangement was that if the treasure was recovered, the English should regain their liberty. So English and Arabian sailed to the spot and anchored where the cross-bearings indicated. The first divers who went down were so successful that all the crew dived down to the bottom of the 15 feet in turns. And then came the great chance of escape. While practically all these men were below the water, on the floor of the sea, it seemed that the real opportunity was at hand, after all those months, to get away. The picture is not without humour. The prisoners above in the craft, while the captors are left behind, with no alternative but to swim ashore. But the best laid schemes of mice and men often work out differently from mere theory. The cable was cut, and either the splash of the rope in the water, or some suspicious instinct in these primitive people, betrayed the plot. So the divers rushed up again to the surface and prevented the consummation of the prisoners' desires. But for all that, the pirates kept their word. The treasure had been recovered, so the prisoners were given their liberty. The promise was kept literally, and no more. For being placed on the island of Ken, there was no means of escaping from this limited freedom, and further, there was practically nothing to eat. The pirates came ashore at the same time and put to death all the inhabitants, and the Englishmen, thinking it might be their own turn next, took to hiding in the rocks as best they might, going out under cover of night to steal a goat or whatever food might fall into their hands. But when at last the pirates had completed their bloody work, they departed, leaving the Englishmen the sole inhabitants. It was clear to the latter that if they wished to keep alive, they too must quit the island. But what were they to do for a boat? And here again we have one of those instances which in fiction would be far-fetched. When they were most in despair, they had the good fortune to find a wrecked boat on the beach, which might be capable of being repaired. Through the silent, deserted town, the mariners searched until they were able to bring down to the beach an adequate supply of timber for patching up the boat, and for making also a raft. In a few days, both of these were ready, and the party in 2 sections began to endeavour to cross the Persian shore. But one of the sections foundered and were never seen again, while the other reached the mainland and then, following the line of coast, obtaining food and water from the villages through which they passed, they arrived at length, after terrible privations, at Bushire, still having preserved their government dispatches. Thence they proceeded to Bombay, but out of the whole company there were only 2 that survived, though the bag of dispatches was brought at last into safety. In the following year, 2 English brigs were also captured by these pirates, while the former were sailing from Bombay to Bussorah, and the crew taken to an Arabian port, whence they succeeded in escaping, though the piracies now continued unabated. By the year 1808, these Joassamees were becoming exceedingly strong and impudent. Their many successes had made them more desperate than ever, and the time-honoured practice of heaving the resisting captain overboard was of course resorted to. One of the most daring attacks was that on the Sylph, an East India Company's cruiser of 60 tons, mounting 8 guns. She was bound from Bombay to Persia, and when she had arrived in the Gulf, she was attacked by a fleet of these Arab dhows. The commander of the Sylph was a Lieutenant Graham. He, of course, observed these craft approaching him, but he had been previously warned by the Bombay government not to fire upon any of these dhows, until he had first been fired at. Under the circumstances, one would have thought that was a clear instance when orders might have been disobeyed, for before he had even time to hoist his colours to indicate his nationality, the Dows had thrown themselves against the Sylph, poured in a shower of stones, wounded many of the crew, and then leapt aboard and captured the vessel before a single shot had been fired. Those whom they had not killed were now slain with the sword, and the enemy being in sole possession, made sail and took the ship along triumphantly, their Dows bearing them company. But before long the commodore of the squadron hove in sight, cruising in the frigate Nereid. Seeing the Sylph with so many Dows alongside, he correctly surmised that the East Indiaman had fallen a victim to the pirates. So giving chase to this assaulted fleet, he soon came up to the East Indiaman, and the Arabs, having leapt again into their Dows, the Commodore was able to regain the Sylph, though he was unable to capture either Dow or Arab. And then the East India government began to realise that something ought to be done to end these repeated attacks. So an expedition was sent from Bombay, consisting of a frigate and a 38-gun ship, as well as 8 East India Company's cruisers, 4 large transports, and a bomb ketch. These at length arrived at Ras el Khaimah, anchored before the town, and landed the troops. The Arabs assembled in crowds to attack the invaders, but the trained troops were too great a match for them. The regular volleys and the charge at the point of the bayonet caused very heavy losses to the enemy. The place was burnt down, 60 of their dhows and boats, as well as an English ship, which they had previously captured, were also consumed in flames, and the troops were allowed to plunder all that they found. With very small loss to the invaders, the whole place had been wiped out, though it was thought that the treasures had been taken inland by the pirates. The expedition afterwards sailed to Linga, another of these pirate ports, and burnt it to the ground. And, after an exciting encounter, yet another port, named Luft, was also overcome. It happened on this wise. Because the channel was very difficult and narrow, the ships had to be warped to their anchorages. The troops were then landed, and it was hoped to have been able to blow up the gate of the fortress with a howitzer, especially brought for such a purpose. The fortress's walls were 14 feet thick, so it would have been a tough business to have razed them to the ground. But the English were picked off by the enemy so disastrously from the loopholes of the fortress that a general flight took place of our men, and the howitzer was left behind. The troops lay hidden till darkness came on, and were thus enabled to make for the beach, where they embarked without further assault from the enemy. But as the dawn came, judge of the surprise of the invaders when they saw a man on the top of the fortress walls waving the Union Jack. The whole squadron marvelled and rubbed their eyes in amazement. Who was it? And how had he remained there alive? And what were the enemy doing? The answer was soon found. This gallant gentleman was Lieutenant Hall, who was in command of the Fury, one of the ships nearest to the shore. During the darkness, he had put off from his ship, landed alone with a Union Jack, and advanced to the castle gate. Here he found the fortress had been for the most part abandoned, but there were a few of the enemy still standing. When they saw the British officer, these presumed that there were more of his followers coming on, so they fled precipitately. All that the officer now had to do was to take possession single-handed. It was a plucky, cool act, and well worthy of remembrance. The fleet got under way again, bombarded for several days another pirate stronghold named Shanaz. A breach was made in the castle walls, and even now a stubborn resistance was made, the Arabs fighting finely till the last. But the town was overcome and left a mere ruin. and such was the effect of this protracted expedition that for some years following, the pirates were compelled to reverence the British flag whenever they were tempted to attack our ships at sea. But as it was with Algiers, so with these Arabian pirates. The respite did not continue long, and by the year 1815, the Arabian dhows were infesting the entrance of the Red Sea. Under their admiral, Emir Ibrahim, a fleet of them the following year captured near the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb 4 British vessels richly laden with cargo from Surat. So again, a British squadron had to be sent against them. This consisted of HMS Challenger and the East India Company's cruisers Mercury, Ariel and Vestal, which were dispatched to the port of Ras el Khaimah, where a demand was presented for the return of the 4 Surat ships, or, if not forthcoming, then the payment of 4 lakhs of rupees, coupled with a handing over of Emir Ibrahim. This town stands on a narrow tongue of sandy land, pointing to the northeast, presenting its northwest edge to the open sea, and its southeast edge to a creek which ran up to the southwest and affords a safe harbour for small craft. Round towers and isolated walls were seen, but no continuous wall. There were about 10,000 inhabitants in the town, and the port boasted of 60 dhows, manned by crews of from 80 to 300 men. In the present instance, they were assisted by another 40 dhows from other ports. In short, the concentrated force amounted to about 100 dhows and 8,000 fighting men. After some fruitless negotiations, the signal was made to the British squadron to get up anchors and stand in close to the shore. This was followed by another signal to engage with the enemy, and the squadron bore down nearly in line before the wind under easy sail, till they got near where 4 dhows were lying at anchor, the depth of the water gradually shoaling, till they found themselves in 2.5 fathoms. At this sounding, the squadron anchored with springs on the cables, so that each vessel lay with her broadside to the shore. Fire was now opened against these 4 of the enemy's craft, the latter seething with men, brandishing their weapons in the air. At first, some of our shells reached the shore and buried themselves in the sand. Others fell across the bows of the Arab craft. On all the forts were seen the Arabs' flying colours, and crowds of armed men were visible on the beach. But, unhappily, the whole of this bombardment availed nothing, and a bloodless battle was brought to an end. In the year 1818, as these pirates had assumed such strength and daring to the great menace of commercial shipping, another fleet had to be sent against them. For the Arab dhows had not merely plundered ships at sea, but ravaged the great sea-coast towns on islands as well as mainland. But the British ships now dispatched intercepted them and drove them back into the Gulf. In one day, as many as 17 dhows were being chased by one of ours, but the wind just suited the Arabian craft so that they managed to get away. And so we might continue. For years these pirates caused grievous trouble, and for years they had to be dealt with. Perhaps the time will come when the Persian Gulf will be as safe for navigation as the English Channel is today with regard to the elimination of pirate craft. Matters have, thanks to the patrolling by the Royal Navy, improved considerably. But that there is still danger is well known, and it would be foolish to ignore it. For we must remember that it is a hard task to exterminate such an ancient profession as piracy, and especially when the practice is carried on by such an historic race of seamen as the Arabs. When any community has been accustomed for centuries and centuries, either in the Persian Gulf, or the Red Sea, or the Arabian Sea, or the Indian Ocean, to gain their living by sea robbery, when they have made such a careful study of the local navigation and the habits of their potential victims, it is no easy matter for these men suddenly to relinquish their previous habits and to give up their hard-earned knowledge. It would be just as easy for a Brixham or Lowestoft fisherman to give up his vocation and take to farming or manufacture, as it has been for the Arab slaver and pirate to become a law-abiding seaman. But as so many of these notorious piratical seas in the past have been cleansed beyond all expectation, so doubtless the time will come when the last sea robber has disappeared from both hemispheres and the pirate has become as extinct as the dodo. But whether the story of the sea will thereby be as interesting and exciting as in previous ages is quite another matter. End of chapter 20. Read by Lindsay Clark, Bristol, May 21st, 2021. Chapter 21 of Daring Deeds of Famous Pirates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daring Deeds of Famous Pirates by Edward Keble Chatterton. The story of Aaron Smith. If the expression had not been used already so many thousand times, one might well say of the following story that truth is indeed stranger than fiction. Had you read the yarn which is here to be related, you would, at its conclusion, have remarked that it was certainly most interesting and exciting, but it was too exaggerated, too full of coincidences, too full of narrow escapes ever to have occurred in real life. But I would assure the reader at the outset that Smith's experiences were actual and not fictional, and that his story was carefully examined at the time by the High Court of Admiralty. The prelude, the climax, and the conclusion of this drama, with its exciting incidents, its love interest, and its happy ending, the romantic atmosphere, the picturesque characters, the colours and the symmetry of the narrative are so much in accord with certain models, such as one used to read in mere storybooks of one's boyhood, that it is well the reader should be fully assured, and what is here set forth did in very truth happen. In some respects, the narrative reads like pages from one of Robert Louis Stevenson's novels, and yet though I have, by the limits of the space at my disposal, been compelled to omit many of the incidents which centred around Smith and his pirate associates, yet the facts which are set forth have been taken from contemporary data and can be relied upon implicitly. The story opens in the year 1821, and the hero is an English seaman named Aaron Smith. In the month of June, Smith departed from England and departed on the merchant ship Harrington, which carried him safely over the Atlantic to the West Indies. Subsequent events induced him to resign his billet on that vessel, and as he found that the West Indian climate was impairing his health, he made arrangements to get back home to England. Being then at Kingston, in the island of Jamaica, he interviewed the captain of the British merchant ship Zephyr and was appointed first mate. The Zephyr, like many of the ships of the 18th and early 19th centuries, was rigged as a brig, that is to say, with square sails on each of her two masts, with triangular headsails and a quadrilateral sail abaft the second mast, much like the mainsail of a cutter-rigged craft. Brigs nowadays are practically obsolete, but at the time we are speaking of, they were immensely popular in the merchant service and for carrying coals from Newcastle on Tyne to London. The Zephyr, after taking on board her West Indian cargo, together with a few passengers, weighed anchor in the month of June 1822, just a year after Smith had left Europe, and set sail for England. From the very first, Smith saw that things were not quite as they should be. The pilot who took the ship out into the open sea was a very incapable man, but his duties were soon ended, and he left the ship. The name of the Zephyr's captain was Lumsden, and even he was far from being the capable mariner which one would have expected in a man whose duty it was to take a ship across the broad Atlantic. Presently, before they had left Kingston far astern, a strong breeze sprang up from the northeast, and a heavy easterly swell got up, which made the brig somewhat lively. Most people are aware that the navigation among the islands and in the tricky channels of the West Indies needs both great care and much knowledge, such as ought to have been possessed by a man in Lumsden's position. Judge of Smith's surprise, therefore, when the latter found his captain asking his advice as to which passage he ought to take. Whatever else Smith had in his character, he was certainly extremely shrewd and cautious, and he replied in a non-committal answer to the effect that the windward passage might prolong the voyage, but that the leeward one would expose the ship to the risk of being plundered by the pirates, which in those days was far from rare. Lumsden weighed the pros and cons in his mind, and at last resolved to choose the leeward passage. About 2:00 one afternoon, Smith was pacing up and down deck, when he suddenly espied a schooner of a very suspicious appearance standing out from the land. Not quite happy as to her character, he then went aloft with his telescope and examined her closely. In the case of a man of his sea experience, it did not take long for him to realise that the schooner was a pirate ship. Lumsden was below at the time, so Smith called him on deck, and pointing out the strange vessel, suggested to the captain that it would be best to alter the brig's course to avoid her. But Lumsden, like most ignorant men, was exceedingly obstinate, and stoutly declined the proffered advice. With characteristic British sentiment, he opined that because he bore the English flag, no one would dare to molest him. The skipper of the schooner, as we shall presently see, did not think of the matter in that way. Half an hour passed by. The brig held on her original course, and the two ships drawing closer together, it was observed that the schooner's deck was full of men. Clearly, too, she was about to hoist out her boats. This gave cause for alarm, even in the stubborn breast of Lumsden, and now he gave orders for the course to be altered to a couple of points. But the decision had been arrived at too leisurely, for the stranger was already within gunshot. Before much time had sped on, the sound of voices was heard from the schooner, and short, sharp orders came across the heaving sea, ordering the Zephyr to lower her stern boat and to send the captain aboard the schooner. Lumsden pretended not to understand, but a brisk volley of musketry and the stranger instantly quickened the skipper's comprehension, and he promptly gave orders to lay the mainyard aback and heave to. The boat which had been lowered from the schooner was quickly rowed alongside the brig, and 9 or 10 men, ferocious of appearance and well armed with knives, cutlasses, and muskets, now leapt aboard. It was obvious before they had left the schooner's deck that these were desperate pirates, such as had many a dark, cruel deed to their consciences. With no wasting of formality, they at once took charge of the ship and ordered Lumsden, Smith the ship's carpenter, and also a Captain Cowper, who was travelling as a passenger, to proceed on board the schooner without delay. In order to hurry them on, the pirates gave them repeated blows over the back from the flat part of their cutlasses, accompanying these strokes with threats of shooting them. So the company got into the schooner's boat and were rowed off. Lumsden recollected having left on the cabin table of the Zephyr the ship's books containing an account of all the money on board the brig. Arrived alongside the schooner, the prisoners were ordered on deck. It was the pirate captain who now issued the commands, a man of repulsive appearance, with his savage expression, his short, stout stature. His age was not more than about 32. His appearance denoted that in his veins ran Indian blood. Standing not more than 5.5 feet high, he had an aquiline nose, high cheekbones, a large mouth, big full eyes, sallow complexion and black hair. The son of a Spanish father and a Yucatan squaw, there was nothing in him that suggested anything but the downright brigand of the sea. But with all this savage temperament, there was nothing in him of the fool, and his wits and eyes were ever on the alert. Already he had observed a cluster of vessels in the distance, and he questioned Lumsden as to what kind of craft they might be. On being informed that probably they were French merchantmen, the pirate captain gave orders for all hands to get the schooner ready to give chase. Meanwhile the Zephyr, with part of the pirate crew on board, made sail, and stood in towards the land in the direction of Cape Roman, some 18 miles away. And as the schooner pushed on, cleaving her way through the warm sea, the pirate applied himself to questioning the skipper of the brig. What was his cargo? Lumsden answered that it consisted of sugars, rum, coffee, arrowroot, and so on. But what money had he on board? Lumsden replied that there was no money. Such an answer only infuriated the pirate. "Don't imagine I'm a fool, sir," he roared at him. "I know that all vessels going to Europe have specie on board, and," he added, "if you will give up what you have, you shall proceed on your voyage without further molestation." But Lumsden still continued in his protestations that money there was none, to which the pirate remarked that if the money was not forthcoming, he would throw the Zephyr's cargo overboard. Night was rapidly approaching, and the breeze was certainly dying down, so that although the schooner had done fairly well through the water, yet the pirate despaired of ever coming up with the Frenchman. Disappointed at his lack of success, he was compelled to abandon the chase, and altered his course to stand in the direction of the Zephyr. When night had fallen, the pirates began to prepare supper, and offered spirits to their captives, which the latter declined. The pirate captain now turned his attention to Smith, and observed that as he was in bad health, and none of the schooner's crew understood navigation, that it was his intention to detain Smith to navigate her. We need not attempt to suggest the feelings of dismay with which Smith received this information. To resist forcibly was obviously out of the question, though he did his best to be allowed to forego the doubtful honour of being appointed navigation officer to a pirate ship. Lumsden, too, uneasy at the thought of being bereft of a man indispensable to the safety of his brig, expressed a nervous hope that Smith might not be detained. But the pirate's reply to the last request came prompt and plain. "If I do not keep him," he growled at Lumsden, "I shall keep you." That sufficiently alarmed the brig's master to subdue him to silence. The captives sat down to supper with their pirate captain, and the latter's 6 officers. The meal consisted of garlic and onions, chopped up into fine pieces, and mixed with bread in a bowl. From this, everyone helped himself as he pleased with his fingers, and the coarse manners of the schooner's company were in keeping with the brutality of their profession. A breeze had sprung up in the meanwhile, and they began fast to approach the Zephyr. When at length the 2 vessels were within a short distance, the pirate ordered a musket to be fired, and then proceeded to tack shorewards. This signal was answered immediately by the pirates on board the rig, and the Zephyr then proceeded to follow the schooner. One of the brig's crew, who had been brought aboard the schooner at the time when Lumsden and Smith were taken, was now ordered to heave the lead and to give warning as soon as the schooner got into soundings. It is significant that whatever else these pirates may have been, they were brigands first and sailormen only a bad second, who had taken to roving less through nautical enthusiasm than from a greed for gain and a means of indulging their savage tastes. Thus, although on waylaying a merchant ship their first object was to pillage, yet they made it also their aim to carry off any useful members of the trader's crew who were expert in the arts of seamanship or navigation. As soon as the leadsman, then, found bottom at the 14 fathoms, the pirate commanded a boat to be lowered, and therein was placed Lumsden and some of the crew which had belonged to the Zephyr. Smith, however, and with him the brig's carpenter, were detained on the schooner. The pirate captain himself accompanied Lumsden, left the latter on board the brig, and brought back the crew of the pirate, who in the first instance had been left to take charge of the Zephyr. They also brought away to the schooner a number of articles, including Cowper's watch, the brig's spyglass, Smith's own telescope, some clothes belonging to the latter, and a goat. To show what kind of cruel rascal Smith had now become shipmate with may be seen from the fact that as soon as the animal had been brought aboard, one of the pirate crew instantly cut the goat's throat with his knife, flayed the poor creature alive, and promised the same kind of treatment to his friends if no money were found in the Zephyr. Even the most stalwart British sailor could not help his heart beating the more rapidly at such a cowardly and bullying treatment. By now the schooner had stood so near to the shore that she was in 4 fathoms, and the anchor was let go. The Zephyr also let go and brought up about 50 yards away. Relieved from work, the pirates now began to exult and to congratulate each other on their fine capture. Night came on again, and a watch was set. Smith and Cowper, still in the schooner, were ordered to sleep in the companion-way, but with the fearful anxiety imminent, and the possibility of never being allowed to wake again, they never relapsed into unconsciousness. Conversation was kept up stealthily between them, and Cowper, knowing that the Zephyr carried a quantity of specie, and that Lumsden had hoodwinked the pirate captain, dreaded lest this should be found out. With a certain assurance in his mind of being put to death, a horrible night of suspense and fear was passed by the 2 seamen. When daylight came, some of the pirates were seen on the brig's deck beating the Zephyr's crew with their cutlasses. Great activity of a most business-like nature was being manifested on the English ship. Boats were being hoisted out, a rope cable, those were still the days of hemp, was being coiled on the deck, the hatches were being removed, and all was being made ready for taking out the Zephyr's cargo. The pirate commanded Smith to go aboard the brig and fetch everything that might be essential for the purposes of navigation, for the former was most determined to retain the former mate of the English merchantman. To accentuate his determination, the half-caste brute raised his arm into the air and, brandishing a cutlass over poor Smith's head, threatened him with instant death if he showed any reluctance. "Mind and you obey me," he taunted, "or I will take off your skin." We need not stop to depict Smith's feelings, nor to suggest with what dismay he found himself compelled to obey the behests of a coarse, ignorant freebooter. It was humiliating to the last degree for a man who had been mate and served under the Red Ensign thus to have to submit to such abominable treatment. But there was no choice between submission and death, though from what eventually followed it was obvious that Smith was not a coward and was not so proud of his skin as to fear death. He proceeded aboard the brig, discovered that she had been well ransacked, and, with a heavy heart, began to collect his belongings. He brought off his gold watch and sextant, packed his clothes, and then returned to the schooner. But before doing so, he acted as a man about to pass out of the world, and anxious to dispose of his remaining effects. With almost humorous pathos, one might remark he set about his last duty. "My books, parrot, and various other articles I gave in charge to Mr. Lumsden, who engaged to deliver them safely into the hands of my friends, should he reach England." And it needs no very gifted imagination to see the sentimental sailor of the great sailing ship age painfully taking a last look at these cherished possessions. The cargo having been transferred to the schooner, the pirates indulged themselves in liquor and became intoxicated. But meanwhile the crew of the brig were not allowed to stand idle. The pirate captain was going to get all that he could from his capture, and ordered the Zephyr's oar to gallant mast and yard to be sent down, and these, together with whatever other spars might seem useful, were to be sent on board the schooner. The merchant ship was positively gutted of everything the pirates fancied. There was not left even so much as a bed or a blanket. Even the earrings on the ears of the children passengers were snatched from the latter. In addition to this, the whole of the livestock such as an ocean-going ship carried in those days, prior to the invention of refrigerating rooms and tinned food, was transferred to the schooner, and a certain amount of drinking water. But the pirates had not yet concluded their dastardly work. Lumsden and Cowper were warned that unless they produced the money, which the pirate was convinced still remained, the Zephyr, with all her people in her, should be burnt to the water's edge. It is to the credit of these two men that they strenuously declined to oblige the pirates. This only served as fuel to the latter's temper, and he sent them below and began a series of heartless tortures which were more in keeping with some of the worst features of the Middle Ages than the 19th century. Determined to attain his object, no matter what the cost, he caused the two men to be locked in the ship's pumps and proceeded to carry out the threat just as he had promised. Every preparation was made for starting a fire. Combustibles were piled round about the unfortunate men, and the light was just about to be applied when Lumsden, unable to endure the torture any longer, confessed that there was money. He was accordingly released, and rummaging about produced a small box of doubloons. This, however, far from satisfying the pirate's thirst, merely increased his desire for more. Lumsden protested that that was all. So again the skipper was lashed to the pumps, again fire was ordered to be put to the fuel, and again the victim was about to be immolated. Once more, at the last minute, Lumsden yielded and offered to surrender all that he had. Thereupon, for the second time, he was released, and producing 9 more doubloons, he declared that his money had been entrusted to his care on behalf of a poor woman. Such human sentiments, however, rarely fell upon more unsympathetic ears. "Don't speak to me of poor people," howled the pirate. "I am poor, and your countrymen and the Americans have made me so. I know there is more money, and I will either have it or burn you and the vessel." Following up his threat with deeds, he once more ordered Lumsden below, and again had the combustibles laid around. But the Englishman stood his torture well. His being was becoming accustomed to the treatment, and for a while he never flinched. Then the monsters of iniquity applied a light to the fire, and the red and yellow flames leapt forward, and already began to lick the skipper's body. For a time he endured the grievous pain as the fire burnt into his flesh. With agonizing cries and heartrending shouts, he begged to be relieved of his tortures, to be cut adrift in a boat and left solitary on the wide open ocean. Anything rather than this. Money he had not. Already he had given up all that he possessed, and after this slow murder had continued for some time, the stubborn, dulled intellect of the pirate captain began to work, and seeing that not even fire could call forth more money from a suffering man, he was inclined to believe that the last coin had now been yielded up. Then turning to some of his own crew, he ordered them to throw water onto the flames, and the long-suffering Lumsden, more dead than alive, racked by physical and mental tortures, was released and allowed to regain his freedom. As if to accentuate their own bestial natures, the pirates then proceeded to carouse once more and to exult again in their ill-gotten treasures. But even in the most villainous criminal, there is always at least one small trait of human nature left, and it is often surprising how this manifests itself when circumstances had seemed to deny its very existence. It was so in the case of this pirate captain. Everything so far had indicated the most unmitigated bully and murderer, without one single redeeming feature of any sort whatever. And yet, in spite of all the vain entreaties of Lumsden for mercy, the pirate showed that the last spark of human kindness was not yet quenched. The reader will remember that among the articles which Smith had brought away from the brig was his gold watch. The pirate took this in his hands, examined it, and instead of promptly annexing the same, threw out a strong hint that he would like to retain it. Such moderation from one who had not hesitated to burn a man at the stake was in itself curious. But his inconsistency did not stop at that. Smith remarked that the watch was a gift from his aged mother, whom he now never expected to see again, adding that he would like to be allowed to send it to her by Lumsden, but was afraid that the pirates would take it away from the English captain if it were entrusted to him. It was then that the pirate manifested the extraordinary contradiction which his character possessed. "Your people," he began, "have a very bad opinion of us, but I will convince you that we are not so bad as we are represented to be. Come along with me, and your watch shall go safely home." And with this, he took Smith on board the Zephyr once more, handed the watch into Lumsden's keeping, and gave strict orders that on no account was any one to take it away from the English captain. Smith now took a final farewell of his old messmates, but lest he should take advantage of the indulgence which had been just granted him, the pirate captain instantly ordered him back to the schooner, and even impelled him forward at the point of his murderous knife. All this time the two ships had been lying alongside, lashed together by warps. Being at last content with the ample cargo which he had extracted from the Zephyr, and being convinced that there was nothing else aboard of much value, the pirate now ordered the warps to be cast loose, and informed Lumsden that he might consider himself free to resume his voyage. But he insisted, on no account was he to steer for Havana. Should he do so, the schooner would pursue him, and on being overtaken, Lumsden and his ship would be destroyed without further consideration. So at last the brig Zephyr, robbed of most of her valuables, lacking some of her gear and minus her mate, and with a tortured skipper, hove up her anchor, let loose her canvas, and cleared out into the open sea. End of chapter 21. Read by Lindsay Clark, Bristol, May 22nd, 2021. End of Daring Deeds of Famous Pirates by Edward Keble Chatterton.